There's no greater oxymoron than the woods. Both the most beautiful place in the world, and yet the most disturbing. People send me countless stories about the woods, about missing people and strange entities that should not exist. And far too many of them have one thing in common: the way the woods go silent. This story, sent to me by an anonymous listener, and titled, "The One Rule of the Woods You Must Never Break," states that there is a very specific reason why the forest suddenly goes quiet, and why you should leave like your life depends on it when it does. Because if the woods go silent, you have 10 minutes. The rule came from Earl Pershing, who retired 2 years before the pandemic and died of it in April 2020. He was alone in a care home in Bozeman while his family watched through a window. His daughter posted about it on the memorial page that the Forest Service put together, and I read it on my phone in a motel room in West Yellowstone the night before I went back into the field for the first time that spring. The room reeked of bleach, and the heater knocked against the wall in an arrhythmic pattern that made sleeping a struggle. Earl had trained me when I started the job in 2014. He was the one who told me about the silence. We were servicing a monitoring station in the thoroughfare, 25 miles from the nearest road. That's when he said it. The context made it stranger. We had been talking about his wife's lemon bars, which he had packed for lunch, and how she grew real Meyer lemons in their sunroom through the Montana winters. And then, with no transition at all, he said to me, "Oh, by the way, if the animals ever go silent, you have 10 minutes." I waited for an explanation after that. Earl was unwrapping a lemon bar, his thick fingers careful with the wax paper, nails cracked and yellowed from 40 years of field work. A Steller's jay was hassling us from a nearby lodgepole, begging for crumbs. The air was warm on my face. 10 minutes to do what?" I asked. "Well, to leave." He bit into the lemon bar and chewed slowly, watching the jay. A flake of powdered sugar clung to his gray mustache. "Not 10 minutes until something happens. 10 minutes to get clear. That's the window. After that, the odds aren't good." "I don't get it. The odds of what?" "Of getting clear." I laughed, because I was 26 years old with a master's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, and I understood perfectly well that no natural phenomenon could cause all ambient animal activity to just cease simultaneously. Predator presence might suppress prey activity in localized areas, but birds would still call, insects would still move. The soundscape would shift rather than stop. I explained this to Earl in approximately those words, and he nodded as though I had confirmed something. "That's right," he said. "It shouldn't happen. But when it does, you have to leave." He finished his lemon bar and folded the wax paper into a small square, then put it into his pocket. The same pocket where he kept his reading glasses and a small notebook he never seemed to write in. The jay made a harsh ascending call and flew to a different tree. Earl stood and brushed crumbs from his trousers, the same olive drab he had worn every day I'd known him, and he went back to work, never mentioning it again in the 2 years before he retired. I thought of it occasionally, like a joke you heard whose punchline you missed, or a story someone started and never finished. I brought it up once to another biologist named Claire Newell, who had worked with Earl in the 80s. We were at a conference in Missoula, sharing a table at a restaurant that served elk burgers and local beer. The place was crowded with other wildlife professionals, and the noise level was high enough that you had to lean in to be heard. I mentioned the rule as an amusing anecdote, a piece of old-timer folklore. Claire was raising her glass to her lips when I said it, and she stopped, the glass suspended halfway to her mouth. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes moving across my face, before saying, "Earl told you that?" "He did," I said. "What does it mean?" She set the glass down without drinking and gave a single slow nod, then asked me how I was finding the conference and whether I had tried the huckleberry pie. I assumed it was some form of hazing ritual for the new employees, a bit of backwoods mysticism designed to test credulity, and Claire had been embarrassed on Earl's behalf for perpetuating it. That April, with Earl newly dead and the world emptied out by the virus, I drove into the Gallatin National Forest to serve the first monitoring station of the season. The roads were deserted. I passed through Bozeman without stopping, the streets nearly empty, a few masked figures hurrying along the sidewalks. The entrance station to the forest was unmanned, the ranger residence dark, its windows reflecting the overcast sky. I had permits and paperwork authorizing my presence as essential personnel, but nobody stopped me to check. The parking area at the trailhead was empty, except for a single vehicle, a white Toyota Tacoma with government plates that belonged to Marcus Weber, a technician who had started a few months before the pandemic began. He was supposed to be working a different sector, but coverage was thin that spring, and schedules kept shifting. I figured he had swapped assignments and gave it no more thought. The trail climbed through the lodgepole forest, the trees thin and close-spaced, their bark the color of dried blood. Patches of old snow lingered in the shadows on the north side of the ridge. The trail traversed a south-facing slope where the snow had already melted and the ground was soft with snowmelt and last year's needles, each footstep leaving a clear print that filled slowly with brown water. The monitoring station sat in a drainage at 7,000 feet, a 2-hour hike from the trailhead. I had done this dozens of times. The equipment was solar-powered, designed to be serviced twice a year, and required nothing more than data downloads and battery checks and cleaning the solar panels of the pine pollen that coated everything in spring. Routine work. Work that had to continue regardless of what was happening in the human world, because the grizzlies and wolves and elk didn't know there was a pandemic, and their populations still needed to be tracked. I reached the drainage around noon. The monitoring station was mounted on a steel post at the edge of a meadow, a gray metal box with a small antenna, and a solar panel that needed to be wiped clean. The meadow was perhaps 200 yards across, bordered by forest on 3 sides, and by a talus slope on the 4th. A stream ran through it, swollen with melted snow, the water still freezing cold when I knelt to fill my bottle. I set down my pack and got out my laptop and cables. Then I went to work. A red-tailed hawk was circling over the meadow, riding a thermal, its wings tilted. Ground squirrels were chirping from their burrows near the tree line, their fat little bodies popping up and down. The stream made a constant low sound, snow-cold water over rocks. I had been working for about 30 minutes, crouched beside the monitoring station with my laptop balanced on my knee, when the silence came. It did not taper off. The ground squirrels did not gradually stop chirping, and the hawk did not drift out of sight. The ambient insect activity did not just slowly decrease. One moment, the drainage was alive with sounds, layered and complex and constant, as it had been for the entire 2 hours I'd been hiking. And the next moment, it was not. The quiet was so sudden and so total that for a disoriented instant, I believed I'd gone deaf. I touched my ears, pressing my palms against them, then pulling them away, listening for the change in pressure. Then, I heard my own breathing, harsh in that stillness, and the rustle of my jacket as I moved. I then understood that my hearing was intact. That silence was external and real. I went stock still. The stream still made its sound, water over rocks, because water is not some animal and does not respond to whatever the animals respond to. But there was nothing else, Even the hawk had disappeared from the sky. The meadow looked exactly as it had 5 seconds ago. The same grass, the same trees, the same gray rocks, but it was different now. Emptied, like a theater after the audience had left. I glanced at my watch. 12:47. I packed my equipment. I did it efficiently, but without rushing. One part of my mind insisting there would be some explanation. Some phenomenon I hadn't learned about in graduate school. Some unusual atmospheric condition, or a subsonic disturbance that had scattered the wildlife. Animals were sensitive to things humans couldn't perceive, seismic activity being one, or changes in barometric pressure, and electromagnetic fields. There would be a paper about it out there somewhere. I would look it up when I got back to the motel. Another part of my mind was remembering the way Claire Newell had looked at me when I mentioned Earl's rule. The glass suspended in midair, her slow nod, the quick change of subject. I got my pack on my shoulders, and I started back up the trail, toward the trailhead. The hike out usually took 2 hours, but I moved faster than usual. Not quite jogging, but walking at the upper edge of sustainable pace, trying not to acknowledge to myself that I was hurrying. The forest was utterly still. There was not a single movement in the underbrush, and no birdsong from the canopy. The lodgepoles stood in their rows like columns in an abandoned church, the space between them dim and brown and motionless. I've been in wilderness areas my entire adult life, and I've never experienced anything like that quality of silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was not serene. It was more like the silence of a held breath, of a room where someone is hiding. I was perhaps 40 minutes from the trailhead, still on the south-facing traverse where the snowmelt made the trail slick, when I looked to my left, and I saw a shape among the trees. It was uphill from the trail, maybe 60 feet away, in a gap between 2 lodgepole pines. At first, I took it for a hiker. The proportions were right. Bipedal, 5'10" or maybe 6 feet, in the posture of someone watching something in the distance. I nearly called out to them. My hand was even rising to wave, a greeting already forming in my throat, when I noticed that the surface of the thing was moving. The figure appeared to be facing away from me, or at least I think it was, because I could not make out the features. It appeared to be wearing dark clothing or was dark-skinned. Maybe it was some dark material that was neither cloth nor flesh. The color, though, was not uniform. It shifted and rippled, the way water ripples when something moves beneath the surface. But the overall shape was perfectly still. Not a twitch, not a sway, nothing that might indicate breathing or balance adjustment. And yet the surface of the thing crawled and pulsed with slow movement, as though the outer layer was independent of what was underneath. I stopped walking then. My legs made the decision without consulting me, as if they thought I was about to step off the edge of a cliff. I watched that shape, and the shape did not move, but its surface continued to ripple and shift in patterns that suggested something beneath the skin was adjusting itself, repositioning, like a man trying on a suit that doesn't fit. Then it turned its head. I say head because that is the word for the top part of a body, the part that sits on the neck and contains the face. But what turned towards me then had no face. There were indentations where eyes might be, these shallow depressions in the dark surface that oriented toward me, like the lens of cameras swiveling to track movement. There was a slight protrusion where a nose might be, a ridge that could have been a brow, the faint suggestion of a jaw. But no features, no expression, nothing but that rippling dark surface, similar to bubbling oil, which reflected no light, reflected nothing. It turned its head, and the indentations oriented toward me, and I understood that it was looking at me. And I understood that it had known I was there all along. I knew deep down in that very moment it had been waiting for me to notice it. It was a struggle not to run. I'd read enough about predator-prey dynamics to know that running triggers pursuit. Fleeing is the signal that activates the chase instinct. The worst thing you can do in the presence of a predator is to behave like prey. So I turned away from it, slowly, keeping my movements unhurried, and I continued walking down the trail at the same pace I'd been maintaining. But inside, my heart was slamming against my ribcage, hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. My hands were unsteady. I gripped the straps of my pack as I walked, and I listened for footsteps behind me, for any cracks of a branch or any sound of pursuit. But I heard nothing. And yet, the silence continued, thick and absolute, broken only by my own footfalls and my own ragged breathing. I reached the trailhead around 2:30. The white Toyota Tacoma was still there, parked beside my vehicle, its windshield dusty with pollen. I got into my truck, locked the doors, and I sat there, my hands unsteady on the steering wheel, and I watched the trailhead for any movement. But nothing emerged from the trees. The parking area remained empty and still. After 5 minutes, I started the engine and drove back to the motel, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds until I was back on paved road. Marcus Weber was reported missing 4 days later. His truck was found still at the trailhead where I'd seen it, the driver's door just hanging open, his pack still in the bed. Search and rescue went out on day 6, after the bureaucratic delays that the pandemic had made routine. Risk assessments, PPE requirements, social distancing protocols for the search teams. They found him on day 8 in a drainage only about 3 miles from where I'd been working, on the opposite side of that ridge. I wasn't on the search team, but I saw the incident report because it came through my department as a matter of routine. The official cause of death was animal attack, probably grizzly. The report noted that the body had been partially consumed, that the remains were scattered over a considerable area, which was consistent with bear behavior. Grizzlies often cache their kills and return to feed over several days. It also noted, in the clinical language of such documents, that certain aspects of the scene were inconsistent with typical bear predation. The pattern of tissue damage did not match known grizzly feeding behavior. The position of the remains suggested deliberate placement rather than scattering. Some parts of the body were missing entirely, including the face. I read that report twice. I looked at the photographs, which I should not have done, and which I can never stop seeing when I close my eyes. Then I closed the file and logged out of the system, and I did not open them again. That night, I dreamt of the shape in the forest, the featureless head turning towards me, the surface rippling with slow internal movement. But in the dream, I saw it open its mouth. Yes, it had a mouth now, a horizontal slit that widened and widened until it split the head nearly in half. But it was Marcus Weber's voice that came out of it, muffled and wet, saying my name, asking me to wait, telling me he needed help with something, asking why I'd left him there alone. I awoke at 3 a.m., the sheets soaked with sweat, and I did not go back to bed. 6 weeks after that, in early June, I was assigned a multi-day backcountry survey in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. The assignment required 2 nights of camping at remote sites to service equipment that was too far from any trailhead to reach in a single day. It was work I was very used to from before the pandemic, work I had done alone before, without thinking twice about it. Normally, however, this kind of assignment was done in pairs. But normally, as well, half our staff hadn't been furloughed or reassigned or quit outright. Because of the pandemic, because of budget cuts, because of the skeleton crew we were operating with, I was going alone. I considered refusing. I sat in my apartment in Bozeman, a 1-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian, with creaky floors and a radiator that clinked in the night, and considered my options. I could claim illness, I could fabricate a family emergency, I could simply refuse the assignment and accept whatever consequences followed. But the consequences would have included loss of health insurance during a pandemic that was killing some people my age, loss of income in an economy that had shed 30 million jobs in 2 months, and loss of the only career I'd ever wanted. And there was one other consideration, one I did not want to examine too closely. That was, if I refused, someone else would be assigned. Someone who didn't know about the rule of the silence, and who had not seen what I'd seen, and who would hike into that wilderness without the 10-minute warning that might be the only thing that saved them. I packed my tent and my sleeping bag, and my bear spray, and I drove to the trailhead. The first day was uneventful. I hiked 9 miles to the first campsite, a flat area near a creek at 8,000 feet, following a trail that switchbacked through spruce forest. Then I traversed a long open slope above the tree line. The weather was clear and warm, and the sky was a deep saturated blue that seemed to bear down on the mountains. I set up my tent, filtered water from the creek, and I ate a freeze-dried dinner that tasted like salt and chemicals. I hung my food bag from a tree branch high enough to discourage bears. The soundscape was ordinary. Clark's nutcrackers called from the white bark pines in their harsh rattling noises, and picas chirped in the talus slopes. And of course there was the creek, making its water sounds. I went to bed at dusk, but I slept poorly, waking often to listen to the sounds outside my tent, hearing nothing unusual. By morning I nearly believed that what I'd seen in April had been a trick of the light, stress, isolation. Maybe my mind had manufactured a threat where none existed. And then I remember the pictures of Marcus Weber's body. The second day, I serviced 2 monitoring stations and hiked another 7 miles to the second campsite, which was in a high basin near the tree line. The trail climbed steadily through the morning, gaining 2,000 feet of elevation before dropping into the basin from a notch in the ridge. The basin was perhaps 300 yards across, a natural amphitheater of rock and alpine tundra, with a few clusters of stunted subalpine fir at the lower end, their branches shaped by decades of wind into flags pointing east. A small lake occupied the center of the basin, water black and still, reflecting the peaks that ringed it. My campsite was at the edge of one of the fir clusters, sheltered from the wind that blew constantly at this elevation. I set up my tent and ate dinner, watching the light drain out of the sky. The shadows in the basin deepened from purple to black. The first stars appeared one by one. I was in my sleeping bag by 9 o'clock. I awoke in the small hours. The watch face glowed green in the darkness. 2:14 a.m. I had developed a habit of checking the time immediately upon waking, a reflex I couldn't seem to break. I lay still in my sleeping bag, not moving, not breathing, just listening. Something was outside my tent. There were sounds, not footsteps. Not the sounds of an animal moving through brush, or the rustle and snap of a deer or a bear. Not even the sounds of something sniffing at my tent fabric. No noises that might signal investigation of a potential food source. These were wet sounds, organic sounds. In fact, what they immediately reminded me of was surgery, of procedures I'd only seen in videos, the sounds of things that should be inside a body, being touched, handled, manipulated from outside. I heard what might have been skin tearing, a long, slow rip, like fabric being pulled apart along a seam, the fibers separating one by one. I heard cartilage popping, the sound a knuckle makes when you crack it, but deeper and larger, coming in sequences of 3 or 4. I heard bones creaking under tension, and something similar to the sound a tree makes when it falls, like a structure being pushed past its limits. I continued not moving, not breathing. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to these horrific sounds, trying to persuade myself that there was a good explanation. A bear with an injury licking its wounds, a deer with a broken leg struggling to rise. Though the rationalizations came one after another, none of them fit the sounds I was hearing, and I still lay there, voluntarily paralyzed. The sounds went on for perhaps 10 minutes, but then they stopped, and in that silence, I heard something else. Movement, closer now. Then a soft impact, like a hand being placed flat against tent fabric. The mesh panel at the front of my tent looked out onto the basin. There was enough moonlight to see shapes, to make out the dark masses of the fir clusters and the pale expanse of tundra and rock and the black mirror of the lake. I turned my head ever so slowly, the sleeping bag rustling slightly against the tent floor, and I looked through the mesh. It was crouching in the basin, maybe just 30 yards away at the edge of the moonlight. That moonlight showed me more than I would ever want to see. The shape was humanoid in the way a scarecrow is humanoid. Sure, it had the right number of limbs. Sure, they were in the right places, sort of. But everything else was so subtly wrong. The torso was a bit too long, the distance from hip to shoulder greater than it should be. The limbs were bent as if they were broken on purpose, or perhaps that they had extra joints, or even no joints at all. It was crouching on its haunches, with its arms braced against the ground, and the arms bent in 2 places between shoulder and wrist. The surface of it glistened in the moonlight, wet and slick, and the skin, if it was skin, moved with slow peristaltic waves, reminding me of the contractions of a swallowing throat. As I watched it, it began to change. The shoulders buckled inward with a wet crunch. The collarbones snapped and reformed. The spine curved into a new configuration. The rib cage collapsed and reshaped, the ribs sliding over one another like fingers interlacing, compressing the torso into a different proportion. I could see the bones beneath moving. I could see them sliding and clicking into new positions. A sick, visceral puzzle being rearranged by an impatient hand. The skull plates shifted visibly, forehead flattening, jaw extending, the whole structure of the head reforming itself while I watched. The sound of it carried across the basin into the still night air. Wet cracks, disgusting pops, grinding bone on bone, a thick gurgling that might have been breath, or it might have been something else entirely. It was becoming something else. A deer, perhaps. I could see the legs thinning and the neck elongating, something that might have been antlers budding from the skull, or a person. The proportions kept shifting, kept oscillating between configurations, as though the thing could not decide what it wanted to be. It was caught in transition, halfway between one form and another, and the between state was worse than either endpoint could ever have been. Antlers budded from the skull, then receded, absorbed back into the bone. Hooves formed at the ends of the limbs, then softened back into something like hands. The face stretched and contracted, features appearing and dissolving like images forming in smoke. Time seemed to lose its function. The moon moved across the sky, or at least it seemed to. I could not be sure of anything except the shape in the basin, and the sounds it made, and my own heart beating too fast in my chest. At some point the sounds stopped, and the shape rose from its crouch. The way it moved toward the tree line was this stuttering, lurching fashion. Did it have to learn how to use its new configuration? It looked like it, the way its limbs swung at angles. It passed out of sight behind one of the fir clusters, and I lay motionless in my tent, waiting for dawn. There would be no sleeping, no moving for me. I watched the mesh panel and listened for any sounds, and the silence held. Not the total silence of April, but an ordinary night silence. Wind and insects, the small sounds of a living landscape, until the sky began to lighten in the east. At first light, I packed my gear. I left my tent standing. I could not make myself stay long enough to break it down. I started down the trail toward the trailhead, moving fast, not quite running, my breathing too loud. I was 2 miles from the basin, descending through the spruce forest below the tree line, when I came around a bend in the trail and saw the deer. It was blocking the trail, facing me. A mule deer doe, or what appeared to be one. The size was correct, the coloring was right, the big ears and the black-tipped tail and the white rump patch. It was motionless, watching me approach. I slowed and stopped because something about its posture seemed strange, made my stomach clench. I had to look for a moment to be sure, but its head was on backward. The body faced away from me down the trail, the hindquarters and the tail oriented in my direction, but the head had been rotated 180 degrees on the neck, so that the face looked back over the spine, the chin above the shoulders, the ears pointing toward the tail. The rotation was complete and total. The neck was stretched and distorted by the twist, the fur bunched and folded in ways that showed the underlying structure had been wrenched into an impossible position. The spine bulged visibly beneath the hide, vertebrae pushed out of alignment by the force of the rotation. And it was breathing. I could see the ribs moving, that steady expansion and contraction of the chest. I could see the nostrils flare, drawing in air. Its eyes were fixed on me, and even those were off. Too dark, the irises nearly black instead of brown. Too wet, with a sheen that was not the sheen of a deer's eye. The pupils were not horizontal slits, they were round, like a human's, and they tracked my movement as I stood on the trail. And then its mouth opened. The sound that came out was not the sound of a deer nor human. It was somewhere between the two, a strangled vocalization that rose and fell in patterns that resembled speech, that had cadence and rhythm and emphasis like words, but it was not speech. It was trying to form words. The lips and tongue, too large for a deer's mouth and too mobile, were moving, shaping themselves around syllables, and what emerged was a garbled approximation of language, a wet, slurring attempt at communication that failed and failed and failed. I went off the trail. My body seemed to move on its own, crashing through the underbrush, through deadfall, through willow thickets and patches of late snow, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that thing. Branches tore at my face and arms, and twice I fell hard, catching myself on my hands and feeling the impact in my wrists and elbows and knees. But I got up, and I kept moving. I reached my truck around 10 in the morning. I was bleeding from a cut above my eye where a branch had caught me, and my left ankle was swelling inside my boot where I'd turned it on a rock. Just like the previous experience, I got in my truck, locked the doors, but this time I didn't wait. I started the engine and drove. There was no stopping until I reached Bozeman, 70 miles away, and even then, I sat in the parking lot of a gas station for 20 minutes, and I cried. I filed a request for transfer to a desk position, citing mental health concerns related to pandemic stress and isolation. Of course, my request was denied. Pandemic staffing, they said. Essential work, no replacements available. I was given 2 weeks of administrative leave and referred to an employee assistance counselor, a tired-sounding woman in Helena, who I spoke with twice over the phone. I told her I was having trouble sleeping, which was true. I told her I was experiencing anxiety related to field work, which was also true, but I was too nervous to tell her why. She didn't need to know, and neither did my supervisors, about the silence or the shape in the woods or the backwards-headed deer. I know I asked for a transfer, but I was not begging to be fired. I needed this job, and I knew what would happen to my career and my health insurance if I sounded like that. The 2 weeks passed. I went back to work. I took only day assignments, tasks that could be completed in a single outing. Routes I knew well, areas close to trailheads and roads. My supervisor was a woman named Sarah, who had been with the Forest Service for 15 years. She did not object to my requests. She could see that something had happened to me, even if she did not know what, and she didn't ask. I was also losing a lot of weight. I was down 12 pounds since April. I wasn't sleeping well. Most nights I woke up at 2 or 3, and I could not fall back to sleep. I flinched at sudden sounds, I avoided windows and doors. I checked my watch constantly, compulsively. A new tic of mine that I could not seem to break. In late August, a new technician was assigned to our district. She was named Priya. She was 24, fresh out of a master's program at Colorado State, hired on an emergency basis to fill one of the many gaps in our staffing. She was eager and seemed competent, and she was entirely unafraid. Seemed like the sort of person who had grown up hiking and camping and felt more at home in the backcountry than in any building. She had done field work in Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. She had spent a summer in Alaska counting salmon. She talked about the wilderness the same way someone would talk about a lover, with affection and familiarity, and with that confidence that comes from long acquaintance. She reminded me of myself at that age, before I knew what I now know. I was assigned to train her. We did day trips together for 2 weeks. I taught her the equipment, the protocols, and the routes, which trails were maintained and which weren't, which stream crossings were reliable and which washed out into high water. I showed her where bear activity was highest and how to avoid it. She was a fast learner. She asked practical questions, not the naive questions of someone who had read about fieldwork in books, but someone who had done it and wanted to do it better. I liked her. I did not want to like her because I knew what I might have to tell her, but I liked her anyway. In the 3rd week, Sarah called me into her office and explained that a critical monitoring station in a remote basin had malfunctioned and needed to be serviced before the end of the season. The basin was too far for a day trip. It required an overnight stay. Priya would be accompanying me for training purposes, Sarah said. It would be a good opportunity for her to learn multi-day backcountry protocols. I tried to argue, saying that alternative assignments would be better for her, routes that might give Priya the same experience without the same risks. Though I couldn't explain what all those risks might be, and I just couldn't say the words that would make Sarah understand. I pointed out that Priya was still new, and the basin was technically difficult. Conditions in late August could be unpredictable. Sarah listened and nodded, then told me gently but firmly that there was no one else available and the work had to be done. I considered just outright refusing, or even quitting on the spot, walking out of Sarah's office and out of the building and never coming back. But the consequences of that decision spread out before me. No income, no insurance, no reference for future employment. In the middle of a pandemic. That would be apocalyptic for my life. Then there was Priya, who would be assigned to someone else. Someone who didn't know about the rule. Who would probably take her into the back country without the knowledge that might save her life. So, I did it. We drove to the trailhead on a Thursday morning in late August. The weather was clear, the sky pale blue and cloudless. The aspens on the higher slopes were starting to turn gold at the edges. Priya was delighted. She talked about her graduate research and about her family in Denver. She told me about this hiking trip she had taken to Nepal the previous year. I listened, smiled, and watched the forest scroll past us through the truck window. The lodge poles gave way to spruce as we ascended, which then gave way to subalpine fir as the road wound higher into the mountains. We hiked for 6 hours to reach the basin. The trail was steep and rocky, climbing through a series of switchbacks to a high pass before dropping into the basin on the far side. The campsite was in a meadow near a small lake, ringed by spruce and fir. Their peaks rose above the tree line in a jagged arc to the north. I'd been there before years ago, with Earl, and I had remembered it as a beautiful spot. One of the most beautiful places I knew, and it still was beautiful. The lake reflected the sky and the trees and the rocky peaks. A family of mergansers paddled near the shore, the mother leading her half-grown chicks in a neat line. I saw some ground squirrels chirping in the rocks, and the meadow grass was thick and green, starred with late summer wildflowers, asters and gentians, and the last of the paintbrush. We set up our tents side by side at the edge of the meadow where the trees offered some shelter from the wind. We ate our dinner as the sun went down, some freeze-dried meals rehydrated with water from the lake. Priya asked about Earl Pershing then. Apparently, she had read some of his old reports in the archives. She admired his thoroughness, and I told her stories about him, especially his wife's lemon bars that he had loved so much. Then I told her about his reading glasses, which he kept in his shirt pocket. He was always so afraid of losing them. We'd had a retirement party where he had cried and pretended he wasn't crying, then made a joke about allergies that no one believed. She liked that story. But what I didn't tell her was the rule. But as the light faded and the first stars appeared and the air grew cold, I tried. "There's something Earl used to say to me," I began. Priya looked at me across the small fire we'd made. Her face was lit by the flickering light, and her expression was open and eager even. "He said..." I stopped. I looked at her young face and her dark eyes and her eager posture, and I tried to find the words that would make her understand without making me sound insane. How would I say it, though? That the silence was a warning, and that the warning meant nothing if you did not know what you were being warned about. I went on. "He said to me, 'Trust your instincts,'" I finished. "If something feels off, leave. Do not wait. Do not rationalize. Just leave." She smiled at me, The overly polite kind. There was disbelief in her voice. "Good advice," she said. "I'll keep it in mind." We banked the fire and went to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. The lapping water on the lake shore and the occasional chirp of a late-season cricket. Somewhere out there, an owl hooted, and I could hear Priya's sleepy breathing in the tent beside mine. These were comforting sounds, safe sounds, the kinds of sounds I'd fallen asleep to hundreds of times over the years, in dozens of different campsites without ever thinking twice about them. This helped me to fall asleep eventually, and I had no dreams. When I woke up, I awoke to dark silence. It was fully dark. You will not know that kind of darkness until you've walked away from civilization for hundreds of miles. Without a single human light source, it was pitch black. It was so dark in my tent. An ounce of panic rose up in me, so I shot up and searched through the tent mesh to find the stars. There they were, thankfully, and the pitch blackness began to abate as my eyes adapted. The stars were a bright spill across the sky. More stars than you might ever see in your life if you stay in the city. It's easy to forget how many exist out there, how many you can see from Earth. But then I fully realized I could hear nothing. No water sounds, even though the lake was 30 yards away. No insects, though there had been crickets singing when I fell asleep. No wind in the trees. This silence was real and total. My watch face glowed when I lifted it up. 1:38 a.m. "Priya," I whispered. It felt like the darkness and silence just absorbed my word, like I was camping in the middle of a black hole. I whispered again, louder. "Priya." There was no response from the tent beside mine, not a rustle of movement, nor a murmur of someone waking. I pulled on my boots without lacing them, and I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could. Then I crawled out into the meadow. The grass was wet with dew, cold against my hands. The stars gave me enough light to see shapes, to make out the dark mass of the forest and the pale expanse of the meadow and the silver gleam of the lake. The mergansers were gone. Nothing at all moved on the water. Priya's tent was dark. The rainfly was unzipped. The inner door was hanging open, her mesh panel pushed aside. I crossed to it and looked in. Her sleeping bag was pushed to one side, bunched against the tent wall. And her boots were gone, so was her headlamp. But the tent smelled of her deodorant and her shampoo, and yet she was not there. I called out her name, out loud this time. "Priya!" But my voice died a few feet from my mouth. I looked at the watch again. 1:41 a.m. 3 minutes since I'd woke up. 7 minutes remained. I ought to have packed my gear and left. I ought to have followed Earl's rule from the get-go, the rule I'd told Priya about without truly telling her what it meant. I'd stated it too vaguely. I cursed myself. That was the rule that could save or damn us. The rule to give us time to get clear, to not be there when the window closed. I suddenly felt a knot of guilt in my stomach. I couldn't leave her out here. I couldn't be the person who saved himself and let a 24-year-old woman face this thing alone. She wouldn't even know what it was. Wouldn't even know what was coming. I got my headlamp from my tent and turned it on, walking toward the tree line. "Priya!" I shouted, but again, the forest swallowed it. I walked along the edge of the meadow, sweeping the headlamp across the trees. The beam showed trunks and branches and undergrowth, all motionless, all silent. I called her name again, and again, and again. Then I heard her voice. It came from the darkness to my left, from somewhere deep in the trees, about 50 yards from where I was. "Hey!" it called out. It was her voice, Priya's voice, the same voice I'd been listening to for 2 weeks. She even sounded cheerful, unconcerned. "Over here! I found something, you should come see!" I turned to the sound. My headlamp beam probed the darkness between the trees. I saw nothing but trunks and more shadows. Her voice came again, now from my right, from the exact opposite direction, from somewhere on the other side of the meadow. "Where are you going?" it said. The tone was different now, confused, even a little hurt. "Wait! Please don't leave me out here. I twisted my ankle. I need help." 2 voices, 2 directions, both voices hers. I was standing in the meadow with the silence bearing down on me, and beneath the voices, both of them still calling, overlapping now, one cheerful, one pleading, I heard another sound, a wet noise, rhythmic too, like a heartbeat, like breathing, like something large drawing air through a throat full of fluid. It came from the trees ahead of me, from the direction of the lake, and it was getting closer. My watch read 1:47 a.m. I had 1 minute left. I ran back to my tent. I did not grab my gear. I only grabbed my keys and wallet from the mesh pocket inside the tent flap, because I didn't want anything to slow me down. And I started to sprint toward the trail, toward the trailhead, to my truck, which would be 6 hours away. Footsteps followed in the trees. I could hear them clearly in the silence, crunching through the undergrowth, keeping pace. The rhythm was off. Too many impacts per stride. Whatever it was had more than 2 legs. I did not look. I kept my headlamp pointed at the trail and I sprinted, 1 foot in front of the other, and those footsteps followed. "Please," said Priya's voice from the trees to my left. "Please don't leave me. I'm hurt. I need help." With tears in my eyes, I ignored it. I did not even look. "Why won't you help me?" The voice was different again. Still hers, still recognizably Priya's voice. But there was something underneath. Something that buzzed and clicked like an insect rubbing its legs together. "I thought we were friends. I thought you were going to train me. I thought you liked me." I slowed to a walk then. The footsteps kept coming. The voice kept calling and kept changing. It was trying different approaches. Pleading, then angry, then sobbing, then back to cheerful. Cycling through these emotions like someone flipping through television channels, looking for the one that would make me stop, turn, and look. After perhaps an hour, I came around a bend in the trail, and my headlamp illuminated a figure blocking my path. It was Priya. No, it wore Priya's shape. It stood in the middle of the trail in Priya's hiking clothes, the green fleece she had been wearing at dinner, the gray pants with the zipper pockets, with Priya's dark hair pulled back into Priya's ponytail, and it smiled at me with Priya's mouth. "There you are," it said, and the voice was perfect. Exactly right, every tone and cadence. It was exactly as I'd heard them over the past 2 weeks. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I woke up and you were gone. I got worried." I stopped. The shape was too convincing, the voice too accurate. For one terrible moment, I wondered if I'd been mistaken about everything, if the real Priya was before me, if I'd imagined the 2 voices, imagined the footsteps in the trees, imagined all of it. Then, it raised one arm to wave at me, what was supposed to be a friendly gesture, a greeting, and I saw that the arm bent in the wrong direction at the elbow. She saw that I saw, and she looked at her arm, then back to me, saying, "Well, would you look at that?" Then her smile stretched wider, pulling the cheeks taut and revealed too many teeth. Behind me, from the darkness I had just walked through, I heard Priya's voice again.
"Wait! Please, don't leave me!"
The thing in front of me cocked its head. The motion was too fast, the head snapping to the side and holding there like a bird sighting prey. The smile remained fixed in place, unchanging. I ran off the trail again, into the trees around the shape that wore Priya's face. I heard it turn to follow, and I heard the footsteps resume, the too many footsteps, crunching through the undergrowth behind me, from the trees to my left, from somewhere ahead of me that I had not yet reached, asking me to wait, asking me to help, asking me why I was leaving and what I was afraid of. I kept going until my legs burned and my lungs ached. But at last, the sky began to lighten in the east, and those voices faded, one by one, and the footsteps finally stopped. The silence was replaced with birdsong and insect sounds, and the ordinary ambient noise of a forest at dawn. I made it to the trailhead at 8:15 a.m. My truck was where I'd left it, dusty with pollen, undisturbed. I got in and locked the doors, and I started the engine, driving to Bozeman without stopping, without even looking in the rearview mirror, and I suffered to keep myself from thinking what I'd just left behind. Search and rescue found Priya 11 days later. I was not part of the search. I was on another round of administrative leave by then, pending an investigation into why I'd returned to the trailhead alone and why I had not reported Priya missing for nearly 12 hours after I made it to the truck. The investigation was thorough, but ultimately sympathetic. It concluded that I had experienced a psychological episode brought on by cumulative stress and isolation. The pandemic, the death of my mentor, the months of working alone in conditions that would strain anyone's mental health. It concluded that I'd left the campsite in a dissociative state, that I had not been responsible for Priya's decision to leave her tent in the night, and that I had not been responsible for what happened to her. The official cause of her death was an animal attack. The report, when I did finally see it, noted that her remains were scattered over a quarter-mile, consistent with Marcus Weber's death. It noted that the total mass of the recovered remains was significantly less than the expected mass of an adult human female. Certain parts of her body were missing entirely, and the pieces did not quite add up to a complete person. It did not say what might have happened to the rest of her. I resigned from the Forest Service in October 2020. I sold my car and most of my possessions, and I bought a one-way ticket to Chicago, where I had a cousin who offered me her spare room until I landed on my feet. I moved into an apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Lakeview, a concrete box with a view of other concrete boxes and a strip of Lake Michigan in the distance. I work from home now, remote data analysis for an environmental consulting firm, work that can be done anywhere with an internet connection, so I will never be required to leave the city again. To this day, I still wonder how Earl had learned about the rule. Did someone tell him? And if so, who was the first person to understand that when the animals go silent, you only have 10 minutes left? So many stories I receive from people end up being yet another reason, another possibility, as to why people go missing in the woods and are never seen again. Well, not alive. Beware the voices without bodies, and the bodies that can change. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and it would be so very helpful if you could leave a like on this episode, and if you could follow and review Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite podcast app. Thank you. If you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I'd love to read it. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.